everyone, and welcome back to the Cabral Concept. Great to have you here today. I'm excited to be able to introduce Kara Collier, Director of Nutrition and co-founder at Nutrisense. She's also a licensed and registered dietitian. Super excited today because we are going to have a high-level conversation about what she's seen in her practice working with thousands, tens of thousands of people as to what throws off their blood sugar to the greatest degree, and also what is most helpful in stabilizing that blood sugar in order to be able to achieve your wellness, your weight loss, body transformation, and anti-aging base goals. So, Kara, glad to have you. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to chat.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why I definitely wanted to have you on as well is because I've been using a particular product of yours that we'll talk about later in the show. And what I found most helpful was, up to the minute statistics of what was going on with my blood sugar and what seemed to be the best for my body, and also what seemed to throw it off a bit too. So I could make small adjustments and tweaks along the way, because part of my philosophy is what I've seen work really well is something called bioindividuality, which means that there's a foundational protocol that all humans need because we're humans, right? So we know what we need to really be eating. However, the degree to how much we eat, the meal timing, how many times per day, and also our carbohydrate tolerance changes from individual to individual. So that's why, I love data. I love being able to look at this, and then we don't have to guess, So one of my things is always at-home lab testing, because we don't have to guess on if your omega-3 levels are where they should be. We can lab test that, right? So looking at blood sugar too, we can start to say, okay, this seems to be your tolerance, or this seems to be the best time for you in order to eat and then have that blood sugar come back down. One other thing that I'll say is that I found it extremely interesting to see what exercise did to my blood sugar, because it's a hypothesis I've had for quite some time because I've read the research on it and I've used a glucometer to test my blood sugar. But when I started to be able to see my blood sugar every 15 minutes or so, then I got a much better picture as to, hey, this is what's going on with my overall glucose level. So we've got a lot to talk about. Again, like I said, excited to have you on the show. But before we get into all these questions, how, you're a registered dietitian, but why did you get into this field in the first place? Did you have any of your own health issues, or did you just really love the field of nutrition?
Yeah, I loved the field of nutrition since a young age. I played sports growing up, so I played volleyball. And I remember just a dietitian coming and speaking to our volleyball team and talking about the importance of nutrition. Really basic information at the time, but it changed my world. I changed what I was eating, as a high schooler. You're not typically eating a super healthy diet, but I changed what I was doing to follow her advice. And I could see immediately the improvement in my athletic performance. And so from a young age, I was hooked on nutrition, became a registered dietitian, as you mentioned. And then I started my career kind of in a traditional clinical nutrition world. So I was working primarily in ICUs and hospitals doing critical care nutrition. So helping people who are coming into the ICU, most often not with a gunshot wound or trauma, but usually complications of lifestyle-related chronic conditions. So somebody with a DKA from a diabetic complication, somebody who's needing dialysis because of uncontrolled hypertension, all of these stories, these suffering, these instances of people who we were catching, in my opinion, too late. And so that is where a lot of my frustration stemmed from, was these experiences working in the hospital and feeling like we were intervening way too far down the road. And then when I was able to help people connect with them, a lot of the advice I was taught in traditional dietetics school wasn't necessarily helping them, and they weren't super motivated to change. So I was seeing all of these three problems, the stage at which we're intervening, the advice itself, and a lack of motivation. And I really sat with that problem for a long time, dug deep into the research. And that's when I came across the idea of continuous glucose monitoring, not just for its traditional use case, which is usually insulin-dependent diabetic, but for everyone, to help solve the problem of preventative health, getting a little bit more insight into your metabolic health, behavior change, because as I'm sure you can attest to, having real-time feedback is much more motivating for a lot of people than that kind of lagging or guessing. Like you mentioned, test, don't guess. It's much more meaningful. And it's just more personalized advice, the bio individuality that you spoke of. The CGMs help solve those three problems I was seeing. And so that's when I went and started Nutrisense. And we use CGM as kind of our core product. And we combine that with dietitian support to hopefully prevent some of those people who are ending up in the ICU that I was working with.
Well, that is the biggest thing. If we look at the top 4 causes of mortality, cardiovascular, essentially blood pressure, stroke, type 2 diabetes, and cancer. I always say cancer is the wild card because you could be doing everything right and then you're exposed to pesticides, as we see other things that we don't know of, but we do know that cancer cells thrive in a certain environment. But if we look at all of those 4, one of the trends that we see over all of them oftentimes is inflammation due to blood sugar dysregulation, or at least inflammation due to processed foods, or let's say high omega-6 fats, processed fats that lead to inflammation. But also typically, if we were to use a CGM, or we would at least use a glucometer, we would see some type of blood sugar dysregulation. So I think there's a huge tie between the two. And if you're doing the things, I say this, if you're doing the things to be able to better regulate your blood sugar, then you're most likely going to stave off those top 4 causes of mortality. And the nice thing is, and I really try to get this out to people, average lifespan is 74 to 77 years old. However, if you don't die from one of those top 4 causes, your expectancy is then 87, 88 years old. You get another 10 years of life if you don't succumb to these. And so I'm huge, obviously, on preventative as well. Preventative is a lot more difficult for general population because people do things when they have to. And, however we can help people, obviously, the better. So what I'd love to be able to talk about now is, okay, someone uses, well, let's talk about first what a continuous glucose monitor is. And I'll let you, of course, answer that as the expert in that space. But, why, we already kind of know why people first would use it, but what is the data that they hope to gather from it and how exactly does it work?
Yeah, absolutely. So a continuous glucose monitor, or CGM, is a small, about quarter-size device that usually you could put on the back of your arm. Some manufacturers also allow you to put it on your abdomen, but essentially you put this on at home, and then once it's on there, it stays there for 2 weeks at a time. And then you can use your phone. In our instance, you would use the Nutrisense app, and you can just scan it over the device and get an updated reading of your glucose data. So the device itself is measuring glucose every 10 to 15 minutes, and then holding up to 8 hours of data at a time. So as long as you scan that device at least once every 8 hours, you're going to get a 24/7 glucose graph, which is really the only way, to understand the little nuances of what's happening in your glucose. As you mentioned, a lot of people might have used a glucometer or a finger stick meter before, and this is helpful. This definitely gives you a lot of insight, but it's still just a snapshot in time here and there. You might prick your finger in the morning, and then 20 minutes later, your glucose might do something, it might spike, it might fluctuate, and you wouldn't have necessarily captured that. Where the CGM, instead of a snapshot, it's giving you a movie of what's going on. And that really helps people to understand the true trends. How are your glucose values overall? What's a 24/7 average glucose value? What exactly is happening after you eat a meal? Is it spiking really high, but coming back down really fast? Is it a slow, gradual climb? Or is it kind of a steady, normal rise and come back down to normal? You get to see all of these nuances and different shapes and trends in your glucose values. And then when the 2 weeks is up, the devices are disposable. So you just peel it off like a Band-Aid, toss it in the trash. And then if you have another one, you can put on the next one. So it's a little bit different than other wearables people might be familiar with. It's not like an Apple Watch where you're going to take it off and put it back on. It lasts for the 2 weeks, and it's a one-time use. And everyone always asks, does it hurt? I promise it does not hurt. It comes in what I describe as like an easy button. So it's almost like an applicator button, and you just push the button and it's in there, and it's completely painless. And then you can shower with it, work out with it, do all your normal activities with it on.
100%. And I can vouch for it as well. I wore it for a month straight, switched it after 2 weeks. And one of the things that, the really nice thing about it is that it has basically almost like a big Band-Aid, but it's the Nutrisense based logo on it. And it held up in terms of me swimming in a pool, showering, etc. Right around day 12, it started to peel a little bit, but I know there's an extra one in the box, which is nice that you could use that. No pain, barely notice, that it is there. One thing I would like to ask you is that why does Nutrisense not allow an abdomen-based reading? Is it less accurate?
Yeah, so there are two manufacturers out there in the market, or two big ones. One is Abbott, and they make the Freestyle Libre, and the other is Dexcom. With the Freestyle Libre, that's the device we use. That's only been clinically tested to work on the back of the arm. So it's the only approved location for the Libre, where the Dexcom has been tested and approved for both the abdomen and the back of the arm. With that being said, we have had people off-label put it on their abdomen and it has worked fine, but it would be, not an official recommendation from our end.
Yes, I'm always doing things maybe a little bit off the center. And next time I'm going to actually try to my abdomen and see, just because it's completely out of the way for all sorts of exercises, sports, sleeping, etc. Since I put mine on my left arm, I know you rotate after the 2 weeks, but if I'm sleeping on my left side, I just don't want to knock it off. And then I'm like, it's not working. So that was just one question I had for you. But what I can say, and the reason why I wanted to talk more about this is that you brought up a good point about looking at the numbers, not just 20 minutes after you eat, because this I found very interesting. Let's say you have carbs at a meal, but there's also a good amount of fat at that meal as well, and moderate amount of protein. What I saw at a few of those meals is a spike an hour to an hour and a half later. Now, we're not talking about major spikes here, but we're saying, okay, let's say above 100, above 110. And it wasn't a normal 30 minutes later. It was an hour and 30 minutes later. So if I was just tracking 20 minutes after the meal, then I wouldn't get the actual data. Again, as you said, you're seeing a continuous graph up and down, and even overnight while you sleep, which I want to get to in a moment as well. So I think that's an important factor to look at. So if you're using a straight glucometer or finger stick, it is why I typically recommend for people that you're doing it a half hour after meal, another hour later, and then another hour after that to make sure your blood sugar is all the way back down. Again, with a continuous glucose monitor, it's doing it for you because it's taking those readings. And then again, like you said, you just tap your phone to the device itself. Anything you'd like to add to that? And then I would also just like you to go over any EMFs that you've seen with it, if you can turn up Bluetooth, et cetera, on the device.
Yeah. So related to kind of the food responses, and this is something that is also important to emphasize because a lot of people want a flat glucose line. And I think you would agree it is physiologically normal for glucose to rise, especially if you're consuming carbohydrates. But what we're looking for typically is how high did it go? We want to hit a certain threshold. Typically, we recommend staying below 140. And then also how quickly did it return to normal? But it is normal for it to take 2 or 3 hours sometimes, especially if it's a larger meal with a lot of fat or protein. So with that being said, depending on the composition, we would expect different physiologically normal responses. If you consumed, just straight carbohydrates, you're probably going to have a quicker spike and a quicker return to normal. Again, we want to see it under a certain threshold and return to normal a certain amount of time to be considered, more on the healthy response. But if you had a lot of fat with that meal, it's going to be a little bit of a slower digestion, slower glucose rise. And so that can all be normal, but just something to consider. And related to EMFs, that's one of the bonuses of the sensors we use. They actually use what's called NFC, near field communication. And that's why you have to physically scan the device to get the data. So it's not using Bluetooth at all. So from the manufacturers, they stated there's no EMF exposure. There are other CGM devices that use Bluetooth and you can get glucose readings 24/7 without having to scan, but then there's a little bit more EMF exposure on those. So it's a trade-off of the manual scanning versus no EMF. So it's a trade-off we took.
And it's a good trade-off, I think. I think people are more and more conscious about the EMF soup that we live in, and one less, bio-tracking based device that doesn't produce EMF, the better. Plus, the actual act of scanning keeps you more engaged with looking at your glucose and being more conscious of it. So I think that's great. I do want to just add that, and so again, I appreciate the no EMFs, and I know our community for sure does as well. And really, really important that you brought this up. And I didn't know that you would share that same sentiment, that it is normal to have blood sugar rises after meals. You see a lot of these so-called biohackers online, and they're like, oh, my entire day was 78. And everybody looks at things from sometimes a very narrow window. And if you don't have any glucose spikes, it actually does then change certain hormones in your body. It's not the best for thyroid. It's not the best for cortisol. It's not the best for leptin and ghrelin. And so when you look at these hormones that control hunger, that control fat burning, that control your metabolism, that calm the body down with certain neurotransmitters, actually getting we're not talking about a big spike, like you said, over 140. We don't want that. That's uncontrolled, essentially. It's just too much glucose in the blood at one time, or poor production of insulin, or cell membrane dynamics where the insulin is there, but it can't get it into the cells, right? So we're looking at all those factors. They all matter. But I am not someone that certainly recommends, okay, low blood sugar the whole day long. That's another stressor on the body in its own right. So I'm glad that you brought that up. I appreciate that. Anything you want to add to that? Because it's such an important topic.
It is, yeah, because I think sometimes with a lot of data is extremely helpful, but it can have an opposite effect where then people became obsessed with the data. And there is a point of diminishing returns, is kind of how I explain it. Where just like you said, we want these healthy glucose responses where we're not going above 140. It's not taking you 5 hours to return back down to normal. We want to get these basics down. And based on bioindividuality, some people are going to have a higher carbohydrate threshold than others. So you might be able to hit those metrics with a different amount than somebody else. So we want to find that threshold, but that doesn't usually mean zero carb for majority of people. Sometimes if you have severe insulin resistance, it can be extremely helpful because at that point you're totally carbohydrate intolerant. But for a lot of people, we can certainly include carbohydrates and still stay in those healthy ranges. And as you mentioned, if it is flat all day, it has some potential consequences because of that. And I like to think of it just in terms of metabolic flexibility. A lot of times we talk about metabolic flexibility in terms of being fat adapted and being keto low carb. And that means you're really flexible to using fat as a fuel, but then you've lost some of that flexibility of using glucose as a fuel too. So I really like the idea of being able to utilize and optimize both systems, being able to be flexible to carbs and flexible to fat. And I think that's kind of the optimal metabolic system that we might be aiming for thinking about longevity, just general health span, optimal health. And so that means for a lot of people, carbohydrates is okay.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And that's really, the human body was meant to run on carbohydrates, fats, and proteins can be used for glucose, when needed, and fats have their own system. But, one of the things that we share in the podcast all the time is that you don't always get to choose when your body is going to use fat as a fuel source or glucose as a fuel source. It depends on the actual state of your nervous system and your mitochondria at that moment in time, right? So, if you're in a all-out sprint, well, you don't get to choose to burn 100% fat as a fuel in those particular periods. So you're going to break down glucose no matter how you like it, whether it's from muscle tissue, if you have any stored liver glycogen, et cetera. So I think it is great to look at that. The goal is to be able to eat carbohydrates, right? Not to deprive ourselves of carbs, but if we see ourselves spiking too high, too rapidly, well, maybe then it means we need more fiber or protein at a meal, and that it's not just the carbs itself. Maybe we need to go a little bit lower in carbs. Maybe they need to be more vegetable-based, higher fiber. But what are some other tips that you can give people if they feel like their blood sugar is getting a little bit high after a meal? Or I would say, again, it's not necessarily, to me, the amount that it goes up, although that does matter, it's the recovery. I like to see people back down within 2 hours after a meal, 3 hours maximum. But ideally, they have a nice steady recovery. They have an increase and then they have a steady decrease. Can you give us some tips on how to better regulate blood sugar based on the different nutrients at a meal?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're seeing a glucose spike after a meal, like you mentioned, one of the first things I usually recommend is experimenting a little bit, because everyone tolerates different carbohydrates differently. So that's a really good place to start, especially if you have a CGM, because it's much easier to kind of see the differences from meal to meal. So let's say, for lunch, you're having rice, chicken, and broccoli, and you're seeing a big glucose spike. The next day you could try a different rice, maybe brown rice or wild rice instead of white rice. If all of those are giving you a glucose spike, you should try a different carbohydrate, starchy vegetables, potatoes, sweet potatoes, fruit. Experiment with swapping that carbohydrate source with the same total carbohydrate amount, so same portion size, with a different carbohydrate. What we're learning and what we're seeing after working with thousands of people's data is that the glycemic index isn't a great predictor of how you as an individual are going to respond. Glycemic index is basically a population level data set that says on average, most people have a higher spike to white potato than they do to, strawberries. But I see individually a unique one individual is going to have potentially the opposite response. They might have a higher response to strawberries and a lower response to white potatoes. So the first thing I would recommend is just experimenting with those carbohydrate sources, particularly since those are what's going to bring up the glucose the most. And maybe it's just that your body, for some reason, doesn't respond as well to, whatever that particular source is. So that's the first thing I would recommend. The second thing, or maybe this should be the first thing, is just like you said, there are good golden rules that everyone should follow. And so the more of a whole food it is, the less processed, the better. So maybe the meal you're spiking to is instant oatmeal. Try steel cut oatmeal instead. Maybe it's juice, try a whole fruit instead. So really make sure if you're having a glucose spike to something, that it is in the least processed form possible. All of that makes a really big difference in the postprandial glucose response, or glucose response after a meal. Additionally, we want to recommend what is called no naked carbs. So eating carbohydrates on their own are going to result in usually a much more dramatic glucose spike. So we typically recommend eating your protein first. So again, I give the example of, let's say you're doing rice, chicken, and broccoli. Eating some of the chicken first before you start eating some of the rice. Even just a couple bites actually makes a really meaningful difference in majority of people. So just having a little bit of protein in the system before you start adding those carbohydrates in can really help blunt that glucose response. Another thing with a postprandial spikes is moving a little bit. So this is movement both before a meal or after a meal can make a really big difference. So before a meal, let's say you have your favorite breakfast and you have a big glucose spike to it and it's not processed, it's whole foods, and you don't want to give it up. Then I would recommend trying to do time your workout before that meal, because then you're going to usually be very insulin sensitive and have much more space for that glucose to go into if you have the workout beforehand. So just as an anecdotal experience, that happened to me. One of my favorite meals was giving me a little bit of a higher glucose spike. But when I have my workout beforehand, it's 40 points lower, almost, barely a budge in glucose. So that's a great trick if you love that meal and you want to make it work on a regular basis. If working out beforehand isn't realistic for your schedule, doing some movement afterwards is a really important component of regulating glucose values. So this could be a 10-minute walk. This could be doing some body weight squats after you work out. I do that throughout the day because I have a desk job. So just sitting throughout the day, if you want to move every once in a while, use your muscles, all of that really helps to bring glucose down. It doesn't have to be a lot. It doesn't have to be 40 burpees or 20 sprints. A little bit of movement can make a really big difference.
Those are all great tips. I shared many of them, but not exactly in that way. That's why I love being able to hear other people's experience as well. I did a podcast, episode 2041. We'll link it up in today's show notes. That was essentially what I learned from wearing a continuous glucose monitor for a month. And many of these things I didn't necessarily know ahead of time. So one of the experiences I had, somewhat like yourself, is that and I did a lot of experimenting. So I ate the way that I normally did to make sure, okay, this is good for my body. I just wanted to check that off. Okay, good. I did it for 3 days. Everything's normal. Most people, they like to think that like, oh, I need more choices. But most people eat the same type of breakfast, the same type of lunch, and the same type of dinner. So, just eat your normal routine for 3 days or so. Hey, how are you doing? Because no one day matters. Like, what if you're really stressed that day? Or what if you didn't get as much sleep? All of that affects your glucose. So at least 3 days is what I recommend. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, as well. But then I found if I had a banana not first thing, but because I like to fast until about an hour to an hour and a half after I wake up. And then when I had that banana, and my fasting glucose, by the way, when I wake up, is in the high 60s. So I have a pretty low fasting glucose level. And that's more my body type, my more sympathetic nervous system dominance, et cetera. So when I look at eating a straight banana about an hour and a half after I wake up, which I don't typically do, but I wanted to test it, I didn't even break 100. And so it's interesting to look at that. But if I did it in the afternoon, it would definitely break 100. So you can kind of look at that glycemic response, which not only varies from individual to individual, but during the time of the day. I had lower glucose to start. My body was absolutely ready, willing, and able to use that glucose first thing in the morning, which is also why I'm a big proponent of some fruit, some hydration, things like that in the morning. But again, some people might need to mix that with protein. And I typically do to make sure that slows that digestion just a bit. The other thing I found interesting is that only aerobic-based cardio or walking after a meal seemed to lower my glucose. A workout with weights, which again, for me, makes me more sympathetic nervous system dominant, did not lower my blood sugar. And if anything, it was either using the glucose that was there or bringing more in for that fight or flight based response. So everyone is a little bit different, but I know from my body, then post or pre-workout or peri-workout for a hard workout, like a resistance training workout, not a bad idea to have a little bit of carbohydrates if my body's looking for that glucose anyways. So again, that's why knowing your body, looking at bioindividuality is important, because for most people, if you're looking for weight loss, I'm not recommending eating before your workout, right? I'm recommending that you do your workout, probably even wait a little bit, and then you're going to have your meal. So thoughts on that, and maybe add on what you've seen as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So related to kind of meal timing and fasting in general, we have definitely seen the effect of the time of day of when you're eating a meal makes a really big difference. And for a lot of people, majority of people, insulin sensitivity, so how we are tolerating that meal and our glucose response tends to be best during daylight hours and usually kind of early afternoon, mid-morning. And then it usually kind of decreases throughout the day and tends to be lowest. And we have the worst insulin sensitivity in the middle of the night. And so this is why we recommend kind of an earlier time restricted eating if possible, because for a lot of people, they might be having their biggest meal of the day as dinner, and they're doing stuff all day and they don't get to dinner until 8 p.m., 9 p.m. And they'll have a much more dramatic glucose response that tends to linger and kind of stay elevated all night long while they're sleeping. We see this all the time. It's very common. And if we can bump that dinner meal a little bit earlier, try to be done by 5 or 6 p.m. if possible, we can see that dramatically improve. And you can even just experiment with this of having the same meal for breakfast and have it for dinner and see how it differs. And for majority of people, it's usually a little bit of a higher response at that dinner meal. I mean, we see this most dramatically shown in shift workers. So we have a lot of nurses, a lot of MDs who use our platform who work night shifts, and they might be eating a major meal at 3 a.m. and that glucose spike is quite dramatic. And then if they eat it on their off day in the middle of the day, they tolerate it perfectly well. So we see this a lot of this kind of earlier time restricted eating being much more beneficial for that timing our insulin sensitivity with our food. So when our body is primed to be metabolizing food and storing it and utilizing it is usually during those daylight hours. So that's something we see often and we really recommend people working on. The other thing related to fasting is kind of the grazing behavior. It usually doesn't cause a big glucose spike if it's just a bite here and there. But for a lot of people, kind of grazing and snacking in between meals keeps their baseline glucose kind of elevated all day long. So they're never really getting back into that 70s, 80s, 90s. They might be staying at like 110, 100 all day long because they're kind of always grazing, always eating something. So that is something we find often, that just kind of sticking to established meals, making sure they're big enough that you're satiated and you don't feel like grazing, especially at night, as we talked about, that can really help to bring kind of overall glucose values down. And then go ahead.
No, those are great tips. I just want to mention one thing. It's very interesting because, in Ayurvedic medicine and all forms of Eastern-based medicine, you always ate only during the light hours, when the sun was out. And it's fascinating to look at that, because when I talk about bioindividuality, but on the same essentially side, the other side of the coin, I should say, there's foundational nutrition for all humans, which we spoke about in the beginning of the show. People love to say, well, I'm more of a night owl, I'm this, I'm that. Well, that's okay. You can say that. But really, if you look at the natural diurnal rhythm, cortisol's plummeting at 9:30 at night. That is the perfect time, somewhere between 9 and 10 p.m. to get into bed, to begin your sleep for the night, a couple hours after the sun goes down. And your eating should then stop 3 to 4 hours before that. Now, you're mentioning this about glucose levels and how your body's not as insulin sensitive at the time. And of course it's not, because humans were not supposed to, think about it. There were no lights even just a couple hundred years ago. So now we're looking at it. So humans, they're not going to eat in the dark. Like, this is not a natural thing. We're not nocturnal animals. So then you say, okay, I'm going to look at blood sugar. But then if you use any type of sleep tracking device and you eat an hour before bed, you're not getting that good deep sleep. Most likely you're a little bit more restless, and you can see these things. So I think it's important to understand that, again, there are foundational protocols that all humans really need to follow to the best of their ability. We work with a lot of shift workers ourselves, and it's difficult. It's also why, if you can in the future, there's no way to sugarcoat this. Try not to be a shift worker. Like, that's the best I can say, because it does throw off your natural cortisol to melatonin-based levels, which affects overall longevity. And so, again, we all have to work crazy hours in the beginning of our careers because we're the new people. But if you get the choice in a couple of years after working to not be a shift worker, I can't recommend it enough. So I just wanted to share that. I want to get your last tip, but I also want to hear what you've seen about alcohol and how it affects people's glucose as well.
Yeah, absolutely agree with everything you said as well. I was just going to touch on the exercise component really quickly. So as you mentioned, you might see a glucose spike, but you could also see a glucose dip in the moment. And that really depends on what type of exercise you're doing. So it's really related to supply and demand and how much stress you're putting on the body. So as you mentioned, something like a heavy weightlifting session, a HIIT workout, some type of sprint, something really high intensity. A lot of people will see that glucose spike while they're doing that workout, because usually you're demanding more than your body has available. So it's making some more glucose to kind of fuel that workout. Where something like steady state cardio, walking, more lower energy exercises typically see either flat glucose or kind of a slight dip as you use up that circulating energy. But for many people, and then this has kind of been studied, any type of exercise tends to still improve insulin sensitivity. So you might see that glucose spike in the moment. And I do recommend, if you see that spike, make sure it comes back down, your heart rate comes back down before you eat, so you're not eating in that stress state, because then often we do see that kind of elevated meal response as well. But for all of these activities, using your muscles, building lean mass, all of this really helps with insulin sensitivity. So if somebody's never done strength training before, and they're having high glucose spikes, we really try to emphasize kind of putting on some lean body mass, because that can really help with insulin sensitivity overall.
100%. Yeah, I completely agree with that. And that's because you don't want to, and we should get to that actually as well. You don't want to fall in love with the data at any one moment, because we're talking about what we're trying to do is improve overall cell sensitivity over the course of months and then years. And it really takes, as we've seen in our practice, and you might have different data as well or more data, takes 3 to 4 months for someone to really be able to reset those cells. And that makes sense because of the way that cells turn over after a period of months. So we've seen that, again, it's taken some time in order to improve overall insulin sensitivity. And when I say insulin sensitivity, I just want people to know you have sugar inside of your bloodstream, and the sugar needs insulin in order to get it inside of the cells and not just floating around in your blood. So what we've seen is, again, a lot of times, like for our 21-day functional medicine detox or our weight loss based program, the first 21 days are really just vegetables plus good protein and good fat. And then we're slowly increasing like berries and fruit into the diet so that we're building up that carbohydrate tolerance, while we know there's just going to be a certain period of time that the cells need in order to turn over if we've done the right things in order to be able to improve insulin sensitivity.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen similar thing where it takes a couple months to kind of see some of that insulin sensitivity improve, glucose values go down. And during that time, of course, it requires kind of consistent hard work working on these different aspects of health, but it's certainly possible. So anyone who has diabetes or have elevated glucose values, it's 100% possible to get those down and into healthier ranges. But related to alcohol is interesting. And we get this question a lot. You know, I know a lot of people are always curious about how alcohol affects different aspects of health. And in the moment when people are consuming alcohol, we typically see different responses depending on what type of alcohol. So carbohydrate containing alcohol, like a heavy beer or a sugary cocktail, usually gives you a glucose spike, as you might anticipate. But something that is lower carbohydrate content, like liquor or a dry wine, typically actually has usually no effect or a glucose lowering effect. Many people, regardless of the type of alcohol, will actually see a dip in glucose a couple hours later. And this is most likely just related to the fact that the body is prioritizing breaking down that alcohol over normal glucose homeostasis, normal glucose function. Alcohol is a toxin, and usually the body is going to prioritize that as the number one thing it's handling. So often we'll see people have higher fasting glucose values the next day, kind of as that normal glucose homeostasis gets thrown off a little bit. But for some people, they can have one glass of wine and see no effect on glucose at all. Where some people, one glass of wine and they see that morning glucose value the next day, 10, 15 points higher. Or some people, that threshold is maybe 2 or 3 glasses. So we do see a little bit of variability there, but it is common to maybe see a dip, sometimes even have a little bit of hypoglycemic symptoms, and then possibly a little bit of a rise the next day.
100%. I mean, and that's interesting to hear too, the rise the next day, which is not something I'm necessarily was thinking about. I often relate alcohol to the toxicity-based process where your body has to remove it, since it's literally a poison to the body. It doesn't mean you can't have a glass of alcohol, but it does mean that we can't sugarcoat it. It is a particular toxin and poison to the body. So the liver does, just like you said, have to prioritize that to break it down, metabolize it, get rid of it faster. And most likely through certain genetics as well as certain enzyme processes of the body, you're able to break that down faster in some people and not as fast with others. I mean, we see that with coffee as well, although coffee not being a poison to the body. But what I see, and this is why I want people to track their glucose plus their sleep at night. And when you drink alcohol, especially within 2-3 hours of bed, which a lot of people do, they use it sometimes to fall asleep, is that they're going to get that hypoglycemic response. So now you'll be able to know, because you'll see it on a CGM, but you'll also see it line up with when you had your wakings during the night. Because as you dip into hypoglycemia, okay, your body's going to produce more cortisol at that moment. It's going to help bring blood sugar or sugar into your bloodstream to keep you at normal homeostasis, but that's going to throw off melatonin. And so you get these wakings, and so you don't get the REM, you don't get as much of the deep sleep, I should say, which is those first 4 hours or so of the night typically. And that's what I've seen myself. So I don't consume a lot of alcohol, but every once in a while, I'll have a drink with friends or family or whatever it might be. And for me, what I see is the less deep sleep, but I also see a drop in my heart rate variability. So I can see that my body was stressed a little bit overnight dealing with this toxin that I had to break down. So I find it very fascinating. Again, for me, just because I see a spike after having alcohol, or see actually the reactive hypoglycemia, the drop in blood sugar, or I see a spike after I have a cheat meal on like a Friday night, it doesn't mean I'm going to stop doing it, but it's still good to know what it's doing to my body.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, knowledge is power. And then I think people can make more mindful and conscious decisions. So, you may know I'm always going to have a glucose spike to X food, and I don't care because I love it, but I'm being intentional and mindful about it. I'm doing it because I'm enjoying the food and I'm making trade-offs. So maybe you have a big glucose spike to a different food that you don't really care that much about. Then it's not difficult to eliminate that from your normal routine and instead make those kind of conscious, mindful decisions. So I agree. It doesn't mean that we have to be perfect all the time, but the more informed we are, the more that we can make those trade-offs in a way that are actually meaningful to us. And it's easier to stick to something in the long term, again, when you know how your body responds. And that's what I think is the real power of the CGM and this real-time feedback, is that, I can tell someone till I'm blue in the face how healthy it is to do X, Y, Z. But when they see their own body responding to these things, the intrinsic motivation to stick to it and actually make sustainable behavior change based off of these items is, tenfold. So anything we can do to make these behaviors meaningful and long lasting is a win.
100%. And I think that having the data has always been the game changer. So I work with a lot of people before I got my doctorate in naturopathy, before I was trained in functional medicine and at-home lab testing, all those things. And I could present ideas to people, and some would do it, some wouldn't. Some did it for a little while and then fell off. They didn't necessarily, see the benefit or feel the benefit, whatever it might be, even though it might be working at a deeper level. And as we spoke about earlier, everybody we know in our culture wants things right away. But if you can really go all in and know that you can, again, we can't, say we're providing any medical treatments or any medical cures, but there are people that reverse their type 2 diabetes. And we're not talking about one or two. We're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people reversing their type 2 diabetes. And that goes for hypercholesterolemia, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, et cetera, because your body at one point was balanced. You can return it to a state of balance. It just doesn't happen overnight. So give yourself the 3 to 4 months to be able to repair the body. But the way that you do that is with data. And so when I started doing lab testing with people in my private practice, and now virtually all over the world, and you show someone, listen, you've got higher levels of mercury, you have higher levels of aluminum, that's affecting reactive oxygen species, free radical damage, et cetera, in your body. And you have lower levels of cortisol in the morning, high levels of cortisol at night. It's throwing off your sleep. If you can show someone that, the likelihood that they follow a program, 90+% we've seen. Some people, they're just not ready, and that's okay. They're just not ready yet. But for many people, that's the catalyst. And so I can't recommend enough being able to track this data. And my two favorite things for tracking, as I've said before, are tracking sleep and tracking glucose. If your goal is overcoming a metabolic-based issue, one of the big four that I spoke about before, cardiovascular, blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, and cancer, if you're doing cancer-based therapies, but also body transformation. It is very difficult to lose weight, re-regulate your cortisol and thyroid, and even estrogen dominance if your blood sugar is all over the map. So it's very, very challenging. And if you're not getting good sleep, it's just, those are crucial things. And I'm wondering, in your experience and with Nutrisense, have you seen people successfully be able to get their blood sugar regulated over time? Do they not wear a CGM long enough? What does that look like from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. We have, amazing success stories that we're seeing every day. So we have a testimonial channel in our internal Slack channel, just with all of these fantastic stories of people lowering their A1C from 8% to 5% over, 6 months, somebody losing 50 pounds, somebody who just recently, this was yesterday, had a fasting insulin of 42 before they started with us, and they just got it back and it's 16. Still maybe a little bit of work to do, but that's an amazing improvement. So we're seeing people all the time who are losing weight, improving their glucose levels, sleeping better. Like you mentioned, the sleep and glucose connection is so strong. Having less stress, being more mindful. So all of these are benefits of getting glucose under control. And it's really hard to make that type of progress without that consistent data, as you're mentioning. And for some people, a month might be enough of wearing the CGMs. Maybe you're relatively healthy and you just want to learn kind of those unique glucose responses. Is your normal routine responding well? How do these little different factors affect you? A month is usually enough time for that person to gain the insights, gain some knowledge that they need. Whereas if you're pre-diabetic, diabetic, or have some sort of concrete goal you're working on, maybe it's PCOS, maybe it's waking up in the night, I would recommend at least 3 months, sometimes 6 months, to really see that progress and kind of keep iterating and making new goals and working towards those lower values. And then we have some people who maybe they've gained the insight, they've met their health goal, and they continue to wear them for that accountability factor. Not everybody needs that. I know it's an expensive accountability friend, but if it helps you stay on track and you know it's what's going to prevent you from kind of regressing back or yo-yoing, then it's totally worth it for a lot of people. We have people who will leave for a month and they'll come back and they'll be like, I went right to my old ways. This helps me stay on track. It's worth it. I'm not learning new insights at this point, but it's helping me stick to my goals. So it really depends, but anywhere from a month to forever for some people.
Yeah, 100%. And so what I'd love to be able to do right now is just, we went over a lot here today. There's a lot of tips that people can take away from our talk. But if people could just do 2 to 3 tops action-based items, whether they use a CGM or a glucometer or not, how could they overall improve their blood sugar based on all of the people that you've seen come through Nutrisense?
Yep. I would say the first rule I can't skip is to eat real food, whole food as much as possible. So really thinking through that level of processing, assessing everything you're eating and trying to figure out if it can be in a more whole food state or not. And the second, I would really recommend kind of those earlier dinners, the earlier time restricted eating, like we mentioned. A lot of people tend to snack the most at night, after dinner, kind of nibbling all night long. Really trying to have kind of an earlier cutoff window and sticking to it can dramatically improve your glucose values. And if I had to do just a third, I would just say move more. Whatever type of movement that is, try to stand, move around at least once an hour. Make sure you're getting a walk in, doing whatever exercise excites you. Move your body, try to be a little bit more physically active.
Those are great tips, 100%. I mean, those are, without a doubt, I would say the top 3 as well. So that's fantastic. And even just 15, 20 minutes after a meal, especially dinner, just to walk. Don't do anything crazy. Take your dog for a walk, take the whole family for a walk. I think that would be an amazing thing. So that's fantastic. And just for my own personal reasons, I would love to know what's the next level for Nutrisense. So Nutrisense is your company, you're co-founder of it. You supply people with the ability, which you used to just before like 18 months ago. I used a Dexcom back in the day, just for personal, biohacking reasons as well. But what I can tell you is the difference isn't with the glucometer. The difference really is with the usability of the app itself. And I think the app that you supply, as well as all the different coaches you have that are giving you tips along the way, which is pretty remarkable, is fantastic. So I do want to say is, again, like I can wholeheartily recommend Nutrisense. I had about, I would say, a half dozen companies that I was trying to choose between that I felt was the best. And this right here was what I still believe is the best direct to consumer. You don't have to go through your doctor. And I believe in open sourcing. So that's what we do at Equilife. We literally open source at-home lab testing. We open source protocols so that you don't have to say, to your doctor, hey, can I run my hemoglobin A1C, my homocysteine? And they're like, well, what do you want to run that for? And you're like, well, I kind of want to know more about my body. So we're these companies now are allowing people to access what they really need in order to heal their bodies. So what is next for Nutrisense? I mean, what are you looking forward to with your company, since it is fairly new, right? How old is Nutrisense?
Yeah, we're about 2 years old at this point. So, we're growing and we're developing, and we do have a lot of ideas on the roadmap. So, as you mentioned, kind of at the core of what we believe in is giving people access to the data that can help improve their health, but also pairing data with human expertise. So, we really believe that those things go very well together, which is why, we give people the CGMs that are historically frustratingly difficult for people to get unless you're that insulin dependent diabetic. So we believe that everyone should have access to that data, and pair it with an app that we believe is intuitive and helps make that data accessible and actionable. But then also you get that one-on-one dietitian support that you can chat with your dietitian through the in-app chat. And then that helps combine the data you're seeing and making sure it is actionable and personalized, and you can understand it and actually do something with it. So from that, our goal really is to help build upon data and expertise to help people wherever they are at in their health journey. Right now, we're really focused on glucose because it gives you a lot of information. It helps you dial in nutrition, exercise, stress, sleep, but we want to pair in more components. As you mentioned, sleep tracking is so essential. So having better integrations with other components of health that round out those insights. So better integrations with sleep wearables, with exercise trackers to give you more automatic insights about the big picture and not just glucose specific. So that's really the direction we want to move towards is kind of having more of a robust platform with different metrics included in it.
That's great to hear. And one of my favorite things about the app that you've created is that it's difficult to always remember what your best meals were and what your worst meals were. So under experiments, at least that's where it is right now, I believe, you can actually look at the past 7, 14, 30 days, 120 days and say, oh, these, because your meals are literally rated, I'm assuming from like a 1 to a 10 and 10 being the best. And it will show you all of the 10s. And then you can scroll down. You can say, oh, these were ones that are particular issues. Let me try not to do that again. Or as you said, make tweaks and adjustments to those meals or even time of the day. And that's really helpful. So for me, I like simple, I like easy usability. People don't have enough time to learn a new app, a new this, a new that. This one's really intuitive, and you can do it by score, all breakfasts. And you can always test, which I always say, see if coffee actually keeps you at a normal blood sugar or not, because some people it spikes it and some people it doesn't. So you're able to test all of these things yourself as well. So really great having you on here today. Any other last tips, words of wisdom you'd like to share with our community?
I know. I think we covered a lot. Just like you said, what I always recommend is test, don't guess. I have a lot of people who ask me, well, yeah, how is coffee going to respond to me? How is X food? How is this exercise? And there is so much bio-individuality. You really have to experiment and see for yourself. And then you'll know the answer of how your unique situation, your point in time, how you are responding. So, test, don't guess, give it a whirl, and you'll definitely learn something unique about yourself.
100%. Yeah. Even if you only use the CGM for a month and you test enough, like you test your normal way of eating, and then you want to experiment with a couple things here and there, you're going to get so much data, useful data out of it. So like I said, I'm a big fan, big advocate. I'm going to use it again myself as well. It's not going to be a one-time thing because I'll always have new experiments, new things that I want to try. And then also you're at a different point in your life. When you 6 months from now, a year from now, you're a different you in a sense, because there's been a lot of cell turnover. There's different types of stress, less stress, and it's always nice to be able to test that out. So where can people, Kara, connect with you directly, and how can we find Nutrisense as well?
Yeah. So to find us, to sign up for the program, you would just go to our website, nutrisense.io, fill out a quick health questionnaire, and then we take care of everything else for you. And then you can follow us on social, Nutrisense.io, to kind of see different screenshots of what other people's data looks like, research we're thinking about, tips we're putting out. And then you can also follow me, Kara Collier 1, on all social media as well.
Excellent. We appreciate that. And I will provide all of the links here on the show notes today. If there's any special offers for our community, we'll certainly add that as well. So I'll link that up today. Kara, real pleasure being able to connect with you. Thank you for all of the advice and expertise you've shared with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.